So yeah, I'm Chris, SVJesus on Twitter. This was a nickname given me at one of SVG conferences. I totally hated it, and then eventually I needed a Twitter handle, so I thought, okay, why not? So as has already been mentioned, I'm Technical Director at the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. I work for Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the web. I started SVG in the sense that I wrote the requirements document for it and got the people together who were all competitors and convinced them that it was better if they worked together on something that would be open and royalty-free rather than something that would be proprietary, like Flash or something like that. Obviously, that was mixed success for a long time, but there we are. And I also chaired the working group that did that for the first few years of its life. Before going to W3C, actually, I was one of the co-authors of PNG. When the patent thing came out on GIF, I was incensed and joined some other people. We never met for years, but we created this format, which seems to have been successful. And also in the CSS working group, I was the first chair of that. I was the editor or co-editor of CSS2, which is where @fontface came from. Actually, that was where it got dumped in afterwards. I was actually working on WebFonts before that. And more recently, CSS3 color co-editor and CSS4 color as well. WebFonts, I was the chair of an ill-fated group that tried to get WebFonts going. It failed because we couldn't get agreement on a format. We could describe a syntax, but basically one company wanted their thing called Portable Font Resources to be the format, and other people wanted OpenType, which was brand new and wasn't really guaranteed to succeed at that point, and we couldn't get agreement, which basically meant that it failed because you needed both parts. More recently, I was involved in WOFF 1.0 and WOFF 2.0, which is still ongoing, and also chromatic fonts, the idea of having multicolored fonts on the web, which is a thing that you have in print, we don't have on the web, and I want it. You'll be hearing more about that later. Okay, so that's me. What am I going to talk about? My talk is going to be in 4 sections. So firstly, some basics. I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page here, everyone knows what we're talking about. How many people here use web fonts on their own site? How many people avoid them at all costs? No, excellent. That's quite interesting. There was a survey done by Google, like the top 100,000 websites or something, and they found that 10 years ago, something like 2% of those websites used web fonts. In 2015, that's risen to 50%. So we could do that alternatively. The second thing I'm going to talk about is OpenType features and CSS, how you can use them. So it's fine, you can download a font and use it, but to use it properly, to use it well. Then a bit about performance, not too much. Performance has been dealt with very well by the speakers here. And lastly, some crystal gazing on the future. Not totally speculative, stuff I'm involved with, stuff I think is going to be good, not stuff you can use yet, but you will soon, I hope. And of course, the more people clamor for it and say we want this to be implemented, the more the browsers are likely to actually do something about it in a reasonable time frame. So, basics. By the way, this picture here, do people know what this is? The metal blocks? Yes, what is it? Yes, that's right. It's metal blocks that we use to actually print on paper. And that's where the idea of an M square comes from. You had all your letters on an actual block of metal, and the size of it determined the overall layout of the type. We still have that concept in digital fonts. So, first obvious thing is, what is a character? What is it? And it's a number. It's a code point, a Unicode code point. Not just a code point, though. It also has some properties. So, for example, A is 65, but it's also the property of not a number and not punctuation, and has a different case form, things like that. So these are properties of characters. Characters can be used without rendering. They can be used, for example, in searching. They can be used in text-to-speech, all sorts of things like that. And then a glyph. A glyph is the visual representation of a character. It's what you actually see on a page or on print. Now, I say character or characters because there isn't a one-to-one mapping. There often is, and it's often enough that people tend to assume that's always the case, but it's not, especially in languages other than English, or in well-set English, actually. So, quick test. What are we looking at here? Is this a character or is it a glyph? Glyph, good, yes. How many characters are there? 2. And how many glyphs? Correct. Excellent. Here's another one. This is a glyph. How many characters? One. Any advance on one? Two. Good. Both correct. It could be a precomposed E acute, or it could be an E with a combining acute accent, and they'll be put together. But either way, you'll get a single glyph, which is the thing laid out correctly. So it's one glyph, and it could use two fonts, actually, uncommonly, but it is possible. The next thing I want to introduce is the idea of a font family and a font face. So here we've got Myriad Pro, which is a font family, and we've got some examples of faces in that family, alike, different weights, but also an italic. Actually, in this case, it's oblique, but anyway, and condensed and expanded forms as well. And I've got a second example of Baskerville, which again has various different weights. You notice that these all have different names. So the sort of normal one, it might be called book, or it might be called normal, or it might be called demi-bold, or whatever. There's no standardization on these things at all, which is why CSS uses a bunch of numbers between 100 and 900 to represent weights. Okay, next thing, properties and descriptors. This is a CSS conference. I don't have to ask if you know what a property is. But how many people, if put on the spot, could tell me what a descriptor is? Yes? Anyone willing to say I could? I won't ask you to, just pretend. No? Okay. So if you look on this code sample, we've got font weight twice. Both times it says bold. One of those is a property, and one of them is a descriptor. Those are the descriptors on the @font face. I'm sorry about the name, by the way. I was kind of stuck, and I couldn't think of a thing, and I needed something that wasn't property, and it was describing the properties of a font, and I came up with descriptor, and I really didn't like it, but we never ever came up with anything better, so... So a descriptor is something that tells you about an individual font face, its weight, it's the range of characters it has available, things like that. And a property is a request for styling. It's something that goes onto some text, onto some elements on your page, and asks for something. So basically, one is a question, and one is an answer. You say, yeah, I can do that. Can I have this? Yes, I can do it. Font stacks. So you all know that you can give not just a single font, but you can give multiple fonts in a list. And you probably know that the first one that actually exists is used, right? Well, actually, it's not. It's the first one that has glyphs that are needed, which is used, which means you can have the second or the third or the fourth one actually used because the first font does exist, but it doesn't have what's needed. So here's an example. This used to be really common in email especially, but also on websites. You get some text in English. It's been sent to you by someone that speaks Japanese. And it looks so ugly. Why? Because they've set, either because of the encoding they've used or whatever, but they've set it in a font which has got really good coverage of Japanese, obviously because they speak Japanese. And Latin glyphs, frankly, suck. So how can we use font stacks to avoid that? Well, quite easily. You put the Latin one first, and then you put the Japanese one second, and you get the nice Latin glyphs. And this worked well for a number of years until people started saying, you know, font designers, oh, we should add stuff for European languages, we should add stuff for this and that. And then they went, oh, all those Japanese and Chinese glyphs, they're so big, it's so hard. Oh, but they've got these things called kana. They're quite nice, and there's not very many of them. I'll add these to my font. Suddenly you're using the sucky kana font ones from Latin. But you can't put them both first. You can't do that just by ordering because you need something else. You need something else. Do people know what the something else is that gets you around that problem? Good thing it's on my next slide then. Unicode range. How many people use Unicode range? How many people have looked at it and gone, oh. Yeah. It tells you which range of Unicode characters a font is allowed to use, so it's a descriptor. And you are allowed to lie, okay? If you say it supports this range of characters, you're not making a promise that it supports all of them, just that it has some within that range. And more importantly, the rendering system is not allowed to use the ones that are outside that range, so you can block off things that you don't want used. You can effectively, without having to go to the trouble of subsetting the font, you can decide which portions of it you wish to use. And it's very useful. Here's an example. What we've done here, we've got a nice Japanese font, and we have decided we want to have this range of characters. Looking at these numbers, you can obviously tell that the first one is yen, the next one is kanji, the next one is katakana, and the next one is hiragana. Obviously from the numbers. Right. Yes. For some things, I mean, like Greek or Turkish or whatever, it's fairly easy, you know, Cyrillic. There's broad range of Unicode characters that correspond to a particular thing. But for others, they're scattered all over the place, and this really isn't a very good thing. I'm really sorry, okay? Once again, we needed to make up a syntax. Unicode was new. Everyone was using it with this U+. And I thought, well, a bit of wildcards here and some assumptions about leading zeros, and it'll be fine. And it's really horrible, and I'm sorry. I apologize. It's one of those mistakes that lives with you for decades. OK, so let's see, what can you use Unicode range for? You can have a really small range. The character 26 is an ampersand, for example. And you look at this, and you see I've got this and that, and that's quite nice. I've got a sort of blocky slab serif, and then I've got a curly ampersand. And you would probably be tempted to say, oh, stick a span on that, put a class on the span, off we go. No, we don't have to do that at all. So here's an example. Let's see if we can live code this without tears. This font is called Rockwell, so I quite like that one. And then lastly, the Unicode range, of course. It can be either a capital U or a lowercase. It doesn't matter, but I tend to just use uppercase. OK. Nothing happened. Oh, because we haven't added the actual font into our font stack. So let's go ahead and do that. Well, it worked a minute ago. Gee. I don't think it needs quotes, actually. I was doing it happily without quotes. Quotes are needed if you have spaces, and in particular, if you have multiple spaces. I don't think I need that, so I don't know what. OK. Well, it honestly did work, and it worked multiple times. No, I'm using Firefox here, and I should point out that I had to do something special. You have to... Sorry? It's not Rockwell. Well, that's right. It helps if you type the right actual name. Thank you. Yes, so I did actually have to do something special with this. In any other browser, this would work just fine. In Firefox, there is a 7-year-old bug about Unicode range, which they have since fixed and marked as fixed, and which they have shipped behind a flag which you have to switch on. But yeah, it's coming. It will be there. But just to point out that I did have to cheat slightly and switch on a flag to make that work. OK, moving swiftly on past my inability to... Oh, yeah, that's what I meant to show you. If you look at the source of that, you can see there's no markup around the ampersand. I didn't have to do anything. I'm just using Unicode range to select it. So the ampersand gets the first font, and everything else, well, there's only an ampersand in there, so they all get the second font. OK, good. So OpenType features. Here's some examples of OpenType features. You can see this is using all sorts of fancy ligatures and stuff like that. So there are optional stylistic features which you can control with CSS. I should point out that fonts do vary in the features they provide, and this was always a problem. You don't know what, in the days when you had to depend on the fonts being on the user's machine, you didn't know what features they had, so you couldn't really reliably use them. Once you have reliable font download, then you know what font features are there because you actually provided the font yourself. So I should also point out that I'm using the syntax here in these demos called font variant, which obviously came in CSS2, but is being much extended in CSS3 fonts. It's the better syntax, it's more understandable, it's also poorly supported, and if you follow that link there, it goes to can I use, basically that currently means Firefox. There's also font feature settings, which are cryptic. They use 4-letter codes like SMPL. They're very low level. They're supported everywhere. Font variant is merely it's merely syntactic sugar for these things, so why the browsers don't just get on and do it, I don't know. They've already got the stuff there, they just need to hook it up. And it would help the poor developers actually quite a lot if they would do font variants. So if you have a bug tracker for a browser that you like and you tend to chase them up, do suggest that they support font variant because they do listen to people complaining repeatedly. Okay, so here's an example. We've got some text here, and uppercase text and some numbers, and you can see that the numbers line up with the text quite nicely, but when we've got lowercase text, which has got ascenders and descenders, it doesn't line up so well. But we can fix that by changing that to old-style numbers, which also have ascenders and descenders. And obviously, you would want to not do it like globally like I've done here, but you would want to actually switch that depending on what sort of text you had. So if you have your heading set in capitals, you would set it to lining numbers and so on. Next, fractions. Now, I've got some fractions here, like a half, and these sorts of things. There are code points for that. There's a code point for a half, and you might be tempted to use that. But it doesn't make searching very easy, and you're not going to find a code point for 86 483rds, obviously. So what you actually want is to have your text set with a slash, and then you want to use an OpenType feature called diagonal fractions. Just one property, you're done. You obviously have to check that the font has that feature. Increasingly now, when you look on font sites, the designers are promoting what features they've taken the trouble to provide. Here's another one. There's a table of numbers. You'll probably want to compare the different numbers. And looking along the left-hand side, you'll see there's something that starts with a 1 and something that starts with an 8. So you might guess that the number starting with 8 is probably a bigger one because 8's bigger than 1, and they kind of line up, except they don't line up, and the commas don't line up. Because, OK, I could fix this by setting this in a monospaced font, but then all the text would look ugly. What I actually want is proportional font for all the text and non-proportional numbers, which I get like this. Tabular numbers, which mean they all line up in columns. Here's another example. I showed you this font earlier. So you notice I have a little FL ligature, which is quite nice. And apart from that, it looks fairly boring. And if I switch on discretionary ligatures, then I get all this weird, nice stuff like that. The other value I can set is none, which switches off all ligatures. It switches off mandatory ones, common ones, and discretionary ones. Basically, do not ever use this value unless you really want that, because you may break. I mean, Arabic, for example, you can have a lam and an alif. You have to combine them in a ligature. It's required by the writing system. Switch it off with that, and people won't be able to read your text. So just remember that the initial value is not none. Okay. Font synthesis. In an age where we can make our websites use downloadable fonts, make sure you provide at least a couple of weights, an italic, this sort of thing. If you don't, the browser will synthesize this for you. It will slant your Roman over to make an italic. Sorry, audience. Slant your Roman over to make an italic. It will make a fake bold. This basically sucks and looks horrible. So what this property does is it tells the browser when it's allowed to synthesize and when it isn't, because you may decide that it's better to just use the Roman weight everywhere rather than have sucky bold and sucky italic. So this is the initial value, which is as usual with an initial value for something that's added later, is do what you do currently, even if that's not a good idea. But we can set it to weight like that, so it's allowed to do weight, but not allowed to do italics. We can set it to style, so it's allowed to do italics, but not allowed to do weight. Oh, wait. It is doing weight. Why is it doing weight? That's because Firefox doesn't follow the spec. Thank you. And none, which is fine, means don't synthesize anything. And we can change that to different fonts and see what they do. What does this one do? This is an interesting one because it only has a single weight and it's a bold. Yeah. Anyway. Basically, as things improve, we should see less and less of this synthetic bold and synthetic oblique italic-y stuff, which will be a good thing for everyone. And kerning. The OpenType specification says that by default, kerning should be applied on all text. Quite a few browsers, including all the WebKit ones, Safari and Chrome, ignore that and use a fast rendering path where they ignore kerning. Whereas Firefox, for example, and Opera, when that still existed, do the kerning. Now, why is that a problem? Well, two reasons. Firstly, because you don't know what you're going to get. You're going to get different things on different browsers. And secondly, this is the variability. You want to actually know what you're getting. You want your users to have consistent thing. It will cause different reflows even on the same page, the same width, the same exact dimensions. So the default value for font kerning is auto, which means do whatever you do, and I don't know what that is. But you can have a much more normal. Why was it called normal? It should be called do what you're supposed to be doing, but don't really, something like this. Anyway, so in Firefox, this doesn't have any effect. But if I set it to none, then suddenly things. Now, don't confuse kerning with letter spacing. Do people understand what the difference is? Letter spacing is the same increment applied to all the letters, whereas kerning means that the font designer has said, well, I've got something like this and something like this, so I can stick them a bit closer together. I've got two things that point out, so I need to push them further apart. It's so that the optical distance between the letters, between the glyphs, remains the same. So let's play with the kerning a bit and the letter spacing. So I can change the letter spacing, and that makes everything go like that. Did you notice you can use negative values and go like that? Woohoo! Don't do this in production code. Okay, so that was OpenType features. A quick word about performance. The first and most obvious thing you can do so first of all, don't do any of this unless you need to, right? If your site is replete with streaming video and huge images and stuff like that, fonts are probably the last thing you should be looking at. But on a more lean website, and depending on the range of languages you're supporting, you can easily find that you've got a huge font that you're downloading and it's taking a lot of time. So wherever you get your fonts from, and this is an example from Font Squirrel, but other sites have different things. There's an online tool when you're selecting the font and you're downloading it locally, same for Google Fonts or whatever. There'll be subset options. Choose wisely. They try to shield you a bit from making obvious mistakes, so they group things by language. Because obviously you can subset part of a language. You can say, just use the ASCII range, which is great until you say, well, my site's in English. Why do I need anything else than ASCII? And then someone with a French name comes along, and their E acute comes from a different font, and it looks ugly. Ugh, don't do that. Okay, so subset wisely, but getting rid of glyphs that you're not using, especially if there's a lot of them in a big font, really has the largest impact on the file size. So yeah, glyphs, big savings. OpenType tables. Some browsers, as I mentioned, don't do kerning, so you might want to get rid of the kerning tables. And you can save a little bit of space. And you'd be ill-advised to do so. Why? Firstly, because you can force it to do the kerning, as I just showed you. Secondly, because nowadays kerning isn't done in a kern table, but it's done using character classes in the gpos table. And the gpos table is also used for things like other writing systems that need special positioning, like Indic vowels that split apart and go around the consonants and things like that. So if you drop the gpos table and the gsub table, then suddenly you'll break some writing systems. So don't do that without thinking about it. And I gave some links to a few things. I mean, Font Squirrel, Typekit. And the last one is to a thing called Font Tools, which is kind of a generic name. So I said, who's developing that? Behdad. It's a very good, it's a thing you can use from Python. You can do all sorts of cool things, including subsetting fonts. Second thing you can do is use a compressed font format. WOFF was developed specifically for that. Well, not just that, but for that. So what does WOFF do? It adds a header, which basically says where all the tables are. And it optionally adds some metadata at the end. Now, you might think, I'm supposed to be trying to make this smaller. Why would I want to add stuff? And the reason is, how often do you go to someone else's website and have a look at their CSS, right? You do that a lot. And sometimes it will depend on particular fonts. And you'll have a look at those, and you'll download those too. And can you use them or not? You don't know, because obviously the font may have been purchased, it may have been whatever. It probably came in a zip file, complete with a license thing, which then didn't get uploaded onto the server, because why would you? But if you have some metadata that has a link in the font to the license or to the terms and conditions, then you can just follow it and know whether you can use it or not. You find whether it's a free font or what the conditions are. So we found that the font foundries, were very happy with this idea. They didn't actually want digital rights management or anything like that on fonts. They just wanted people to have access to the information to know whether they can use it or not. If you're using it and you're not allowed to, that's between your lawyers and their lawyers. The browser doesn't have to get involved. And then what WOFF does is it zips each table, gzip. The tables are done individually, which with gzip happens to work quite well. But the overall result, because it's not a very specific type of compression, it's just generic compression, it's not all that great. It helps. Gzip was used because it's already in the browser. It's already used in the PNG format. It's already used in the HTTP, so we might as well reuse it. Once WOFF was established, we then went on to phase 2, which is doing it properly. So WOFF2 compression, it's a lot more complex. The first thing it does is it split. So OpenType is designed really for ease of use for an application. So the stuff is laid out in memory with lots of padding and stuff, and things are duplicated in multiple places. The same information is given in multiple ways, depending on what applications want to use. And that means a lot of it can actually be recalculated. You can throw some of it away and then recalculate it. You can also, there's different types of data, and if you put all the similar types together, it compresses better. And lastly, if you use a compression algorithm that's specifically designed for fonts and has been tuned for that, you get much better results. Apart from that, it's the same as WOFF1. So when I say much better results, the 100% is the typical, well, that's your uncompressed font. WOFF1 will take that down to 45% of the size. And WOFF2 will take it down to 32% for a true type font. I'll explain what I mean by that later. So you can see that, yeah, you're grinding it down. You're down a third of the size. So that's definitely worth doing. So WOFF2 with true type glyphs, which is the most common sort on the web currently, although that's changing, gives you 68% compression, which is 25% better than WOFF1. If, however, you have PostScript glyphs, CFF glyphs, you get less good compression. That's because the font-specific compression is able to do more with the true type format. It can rearrange data and make it more compressible. But it's still worth doing. It's still better than WOFF1. I should point out that it's not a free lunch. There's a very talented compression team that work on the Brotli compression, which is used in WOFF2. And they're always saying, oh, we've got this new improvement, we've got an extra 0.5%. It's like, keeping going. It's great. But at some point, someone said, how long does it take to decompress? Now, this is already an asymmetric compression, which means It's fast to decompress and slow to compress, which is fine because you compress it once and shove it on the server, and millions of people hopefully download it and they all decompress it. So you want that. But what we found was the last 1 or 2%, squeezing that down, could double the decompression size. So you're making the font fractionally smaller, but not small enough to really impact the download time. But then your page is hanging there while all these fonts are decompressing. And actually, if you would back off the performance a little bit, back off the compression a little bit, then you would get a much faster page load over time. This is more a note for us rather than a note for you, because the way that WOFF is done, there will be some command line tweaks and stuff, but basically the default settings should avoid this situation. Since I mentioned performance on mobile, I should also say that we tested the memory used for decompression. And it's much the same as WOFF, slightly larger, but not enough to worry about. Okay, so if you have fonts used on your site, then you may find that they're not loaded because you haven't got any text that uses them. And then when people enter text that uses them, there will be a lag, because suddenly the browser will say, oh, I need to download that after all, and it'll go off and get it. Which is the point at which you step away from CSS and into the world of JavaScript and force it to download the thing that you know you're going to be using. So just to show that this isn't scary, here's an app font face rule, which you can see and understand and you know what it's doing. And here is a new font face object, which, as you can see, is basically the same thing. And it's declaring a font and saying, I'm going to be using this. Once you've done that, you can trigger it to download, and you get events, which are promises. You can get one about when the loading has started, when the loading has finished, or when the loading has ended with an error. And what can you do with that? Well, you can then stick a little handler on it. When the promise returns, use the value, and basically add a class to say, OK, I'm going to use this font, which means if it fails, you don't ever add the class, and you try to use a font that doesn't exist. So this does give you a lot more flexibility to do things like that. This is fairly new. It's supported in Chrome and Opera and Android. It's not supported in the others yet, but it will be, because this is pretty useful stuff. But I've put it here because it's kind of new, and you might not know about it. OK, the future, the crystal ball, the no, I can't use this yet stuff. So the first thing I want to talk about is colored fonts, or colored type in general, since this obviously isn't a font. This was hand-painted by monks, probably taking years. But illuminated manuscripts is one driver. OK, it's not a driver. Nobody cares about illuminated manuscripts. It's just a nice historical example. The actual driver and the real use case, of course, is emoji, which everyone wanted to use. And at first, these were just little crappy raster images, and then people said, no, well, let's use a font technology to do this. We're going to have to extend the font. OK, let's do that, because we really want to do these properly and have nice vector effects for our emoji, and let's get rid of that. You will thank me, by the way, if you go to this page, there's a really irritating soundtrack as well, which I had the thought to mute. And here's a third use case. I saw a fascinating talk at one of the international typography conferences, ATypI. There was a chap who went around India talking to sign painters, because when a shop, like a fruit store or something, wants to have a banner advertising themselves, they hire someone to paint the letters on cloth. And this is a photo. I mean, these things are huge, right? And they do all this hand-painted signage. And he asked them to design fonts for him, which they did, and they provided them on pieces of cloth in multiple colors, because that's what text looks like, right? I mean, these are gorgeous, these are beautiful. Unfortunately, these people are going out of business because they're getting replaced by, a PC and a laser printer or a vinyl printer. But, and interestingly as well, I mean, this is from India, but also I was, a couple of months ago, I was in Brazil at another typography conference, and there was a woman there who'd gone down the Amazon, and equally there are sign painters for boats and things, which have also a tradition of multicolored type. So this is an interesting thing, it's a useful thing to revive. Let's have a quick look at how we might do this. So here's an example. This looks quite nice, doesn't it? This is actually that same thing that I just showed you on the cloth, but done here on a web page. And you might think, well, OK, great, you can do it. What's the problem? And that's the problem. This is 9 different fonts, all with different colors, slapped together using absolute positioning. And that also means that when you look at the markup, you've got the same text multiple times, the same text multiple times, the same text multiple times, and that's really going to hurt your search. You actually might get sites blocking this because you've got repeated text, and they'll think you're trying to spoof SEO, and you just don't want to do that at all. So this is how we're doing for time. 9 minutes. Okay, quick poll. Shall I live dangerously or shall I not? This will take about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Dangerous. Okay, let's go for it. Right. So here is the fonts that I was using. You can see there's 10 of them. I'm going to open this one up in TransType. Then what I'm going to do is drop the other ones also into TransType. Then I'm going to select them all. And then I'm going to pick an effect called Overlay Fonts. And now I'm going to pick some colors that don't suck. And I'm doing this quickly, so actually they will suck. That's fine. Basically, the design of this is having 4 colors for the top and 4 for the bottom. Oh, this is really hideous, isn't it? I'm sorry. There we go. That'll do. That'll do. And say OK, and change the family name to something more sensible, and export. And let's put it there. Padoom. OK, so let's see what we've got. There's my fonts directory that I'm using. There's the Kafil. No, I don't want it there. Oh, stupid thing. And it has produced 4 different fonts. Why 4? Because there are 4 different ways of doing this. Yay! There's the way that Google does it, which involves using PNG images at all different sizes, which kind of sucks. There's the way Apple does it, which is called SBIX, which is an undocumented thing, which also uses raster images and is also not very good. And there's the way that Microsoft do it, which is using stacked TrueType outlines. And then there's the SVG glyphs and OpenType, which is what I was telling you about earlier. OK, so we have these 4 things. Let us see. If this doesn't work, then it's OK, because I do actually have a backup. A quick look. What did I do for this? Yeah, that looks all right, doesn't it? OK. And no. OK. Let's quickly recover from that. As they say in cooking programs, here are the ones I prepared earlier. Yes, really do. Thank you. OK, so this is the first format that is useful. It uses an OpenType table called color, which holds a stack of TrueType outlines. The first one will be used as a fallback if color fonts are not supported. And then there's another one called PAL, CPAL, which holds the palettes. So you saw me selecting the colors there. Those colors go into the font itself. And there's the one, well, actually, that's the ones I picked last time when I was practicing this demo. So OK, that works. And this is just, it's a single line of text. We haven't got multiple lines or anything like that. So it's pretty good, right? It's working well. Can anyone see a problem with it? Yes. The color property. Yeah, exactly. In fact, how do I style any of this? We've lost something, haven't we? Where did the styling go? The colors are now baked into the font, which is fine if you're making your own fonts, but if you're buying them or something, that's really not very helpful, is it? So let's have another option. So SVG, so you've heard of SVG fonts, right? I didn't mention them earlier, but you've heard of SVG fonts, and you know that you shouldn't use them ever. Okay, good. It was a temporary hack at a time when we didn't have reliable downloadable fonts, okay? It served its purpose. It had really terrible internationalization. It was only ever intended as a throwaway temporary stopgap, so don't use them, they're terrible. So it's much the same. You have an SVG table which contains some SVG, which can do anything. So I mean, that's the problem with the previous thing. Each overlay is a solid color. That's all you can have is a solid color fill. And then you've got cpal optionally to have these palettes. And then you use CSS variables to alter the palette. So this is one of the other ones. This is the SVG one that I exported. Looks much the same. I mean, here it's not using the SVG. It's not using gradients or doing anything fancy. It's just overlaid solid text. But let's see how we can do this. So I've used different colors here. Let's pick something and make it really hideous. Let's change the hue there and change the hue there and maybe the saturation, and let's change that white to yellow. And yeah, okay, so we can using CSS variables, and these are predefined in the spec. It says you must have them called color 0 to color n, and they will correspond to entries in the palette. And you can therefore style the SVG ones themselves. You can't style the other ones, though. The true type ones, they're not stylable like that, which is a shame. But OK, at least this one works. So it's now, I've been telling you about CSS3 fonts. Let's tell you about CSS4 fonts, which is basically about 2 pages long and full of jotted down ideas on the back of an envelope, one of which is a thing called font palette. So you can have multiple palettes in these fonts. You can have, for example, one that's designed for text set on a dark background and one on light background. So this lets you select between available palettes. Also an app palette entries function, which lets you override specific palette entries. So instead of relying on using CSS variables and having the SVG actually have var functions to call up those, instead it says, no, let's just override the palette directly. Just override individual palette entries. And that's how you would do that, using the app palette entries. Lastly, I mentioned font synthesis already and said you can switch off fake bold and you can switch off fake italic. There is another abomination waiting to be killed, which is fake small caps. And you do fake small caps by taking a capital and squashing it down and making it smaller, which means it's thinner and lighter than it should be compared to the other glyphs, and it looks kind of ugly. So this will be a way to disable that too. And lastly, you know about the font families, you know, the serif and sans serif and fantasy. Has anyone ever used generic font family fantasy in a production website ever? No. I have no idea why we have that one. It's such a stupid idea. Anyway, there will be some more. There will be emoji. There will be math. And Fang Song, which I don't speak Chinese, so I'm not quite sure what this is, but apparently there is a distinction which is relevant for you. Does anyone actually speak Chinese and can tell me what this means? Okay, thank you. Actually, if you could mail me afterwards with a longer explanation, that would be great. Because I really do want to understand that. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. Yes, indeed, that's me as a reminder again. These slides are up on my GitHub, so if you want to have a look at them, then they are. And I guess we still have a minute for questions.
In the declarations you're using, you were limiting the fonts available to certain subsets of that. Is that an API that's sent with the request, or is it limited on the client side? Like, does it
okay, yeah, that is not affecting the request. Now, you can do that yourself, okay? What you can do is subset the font that you're using. So it's called Foo. You can make Foo Chinese and Foo Thai and Foo Arabic and whatever. And then you can have multiple at-font face declarations, all of which have the same font family, and all of which has the same weight and so on, but you use Unicode range. And then what will happen is when the browser needs to fetch one of these, it will, and the ones that it doesn't need to, it won't fetch. So depending on what the content is on your page, effectively you can do your own subsetting, but still combine them into the same font family. So on your actual CSS, you just give the font family name. And also, if you combine that with font loading API, you can force the ones that you know you're about to use to load earlier and leave the ones as backup in case someone types in their name and it's in Turkish or something like that. So that is a good way to do it. But yes, it's not talking to the server and saying subset this font for me and then give it to me. The Google Fonts API does that. If you look where it does an at import, you'll see that the URL's got a query part with basically which ranges of stuff to use. Bear in mind, though, if you use that, you're doing 2 HTTP requests. The first one is actually getting that font face in a style sheet, a 6-line style sheet, and the second one is actually getting the fonts referred to from that. But I believe Google is actually subsetting those on the fly when you do that. Does that answer the question? Good.
Yeah. I know IE6 implemented the @font face, well, all those years ago.
Yes, they did.
Why did things sort of stall out for a long time with @font face?
Okay, that's a good question. Yes, I think 5.5 even implemented @font face. So at the time, it may even have been 4. Okay, so at the time, this was at the time of the browser wars, there were the 2 browsers, Internet Explorer and Netscape, and they basically did everything the opposite way to each other. So Netscape at that time hated style sheets. They said they would never implement style sheets. They used a link tag in the HTML which linked directly to a font, and they would only accept one format, which was called PFR, Portable Font Resource, which was a proprietary technology from Bitstream. They rapidly gave that up when they morphed into being Mozilla, because then they had to open source their stuff, and they couldn't have all this code that was using proprietary things, so they just dropped it. Meanwhile, Microsoft did the W3C standard way without font face, but they were the only browser to do so, so people kind of didn't care. And it was using another proprietary thing called embedded OpenType, which was using a font compression license from Agfa Monotype, which was proprietary and protected by patents. So nobody would touch either of them, and that's why it failed, because there wasn't an effective universal download mechanism for the font. There wasn't a format. We had a syntax, but only one browser was using it, and we didn't have a format. It was SVG fonts. The reason they took off was because they used the same syntax, but we also mandated in the SVG spec, you can support any font format what you want, but you have to support SVG fonts. And SVG fonts use the exact same path syntax as SVG does, so the incremental cost to implement was small. And so people would do that. And it worked for a while. It stopgapped us. It was okay. I mean, at that time, especially on phones, if you had SVG on a phone, they often had no access to the fonts that were on the platform. They were kind of sandboxed. So you had to send down a font with it. And so that worked, but that was just on phones, on feature phones and stuff. This was before, the good phones, before smartphones. And on the desktop, things languished until we had an operation. People said, we have to have a single font format that everyone supports. And people got behind that. The foundries got behind that. It was incredible. About 2006 or so, I still have a really ratty T-shirt from a 2006 font thing, which I took because people were getting up on stage and saying, we are the last generation of typographers. The web will kill us all. We will be selling peanuts on the streets, etc. 2 years later, these same people were saying, our entire font library is now available both for the web and for print. You can buy it on the web, you can buy it on print. You'll require 2 different licenses. We get to sell the same font to people twice. This is great. That's what it took. I mean, there was a lot of suspicion between the browser people and the font developers. And getting them talking to each other which is the sort of thing that W3C does, getting competing industries to talk to each other and agree on a standard. That was what it took, actually.
All right. Thank you, Chris. I'm sure you could fill a whole other conference with all of those. Thank you so much. Cheers.